So, hi, I'm the Amateur Logician, and presently I want to look at Chapter 3 of Edward Feser's book, Immortal Souls, a treatise on human nature, which is a relatively new book because it overlaps with some relatively recent topics on my YouTube channel dealing with universals and concepts and ideas. So, let's get started. When you pick up a traditional logic book, it often will explain how the intellect can form concepts, propositions, and reason. There are three acts of the mind, and this is a distinctive feature of man versus a mere animal. We are rational animals. Now, Chapter 3 is on the intellect. It covers how we can indeed form concepts, propositions, and reason. It's thereby very appropriate for us to look at it from the perspective of logic. So we'll see that Part 1 is what is mind? Chapter 1, the short answer. Chapter 2, the self. Chapter 3, the intellect. And Chapter 4, the will. Part 2 gets into what is the body. We have matter and animality. Part 3 is what is a human being? Chapter 7, against Cartesianism. Chapter 8, against materialism. Chapter 9, neither computers nor brains. And Part 4 is what is the soul? Immortality and the form of the body. The chapter on the intellect starts out with the difference between intellect versus sentience. That you and I can study logic makes us categorically different than mere animals. We have, so to speak, various propositional attitudes. Dr. Feser talks about the active intellect and passive intellect. The active intellect is what forms concepts or ideas, and the passive intellect stores them. Now, like animals, we have external senses like sight, hearing, etc. We also, like animals, have internal senses. These include the synthetic sense, also known as the common sense, instinct, imagination, and sense memory. Now, the next section is against imagism. Now, in fact, in previous videos on my YouTube channel, we've talked about how a concept isn't equivalent to and cannot be reduced to an image. For one thing, concepts are universal, but images are going to be particular. A concept's universality abstracts away from particularities. I would say basically that an image is, so to speak, material, concrete, variable, and individual. Conversely, so to speak, a concept is strictly immaterial, abstract, constant, and universal. They're not on par at all. Now, Dr. Feser explains that concepts have a clarity and distinctiveness that no image can possess. Even moreover, there are things that we have a concept of, but don't have any image at all. Feser gives the example of a geometrical notion of a line, or the abstract concept of law. And when we think about propositions, these cannot be equated with mental images either. Feser writes, quote, mental images, like all pictorial representations, are inevitably ambiguous or indeterminate in their content, end quote. We can have a proposition like a cat is on the mat, and then we can have an image of this, but what makes that image equivalent to a cat is on the mat versus an animal is on the mat? Even worse, consider negations in propositions, conditionals, disjunctions, etc. There's no way such propositions can be equivalent to some kind of picture, some kind of image. So that doesn't work any more than we can equate a concept with a mere image. Now, the next section deals with what are concepts. Note that concepts have intentionality. That is, they are aimed or directed at something. You and I can have the concept of a triangle as a mental representation. John Searle would say that concepts have intrinsic intentionality. In scholastic philosophy and logic, we would say that these are formal signs. And in a previous video, we talked about the logic of signs, including formal signs, but also instrumental signs. Words have derived intentionality, and in scholastic philosophy and logic, we would say that these are instrumental signs. Concepts are ideas, right? So they classify, they categorize. Concepts have compositionality. We can combine concepts into new concepts. Concepts have productivity. That is, out of the finite primitive concepts we have, we can produce an infinite number of compound concepts and even compound propositions. Think of a regular polygon with n sides. There are an infinite amount of possibilities here. Both concepts and propositions also have systematicity. That is, when we entertain one concept or proposition, that goes with entertaining others. Another important consideration that Dr. Feser writes about is that concepts have a public character. That's why we can communicate with each other. It's why we can argue and agree or disagree with each other. Someone might, however, argue that people don't have the same beliefs about the same thing, and so they don't have the same concept. But we then need to draw a distinction between concepts and conceptions. It doesn't follow from people having different conceptions of things that they have different concepts. You might know a lot more chemistry than I, and so we have a different conception of some chemical, but the same concept can be under consideration. Now, modern empiricism doesn't embrace imagism, but it has what are called proxy types. Yet Feser argues it suffers from the same kind of problems as imagism. He writes, for example, that, quote, like imagism, neo-empiricism essentially reduces the intellect to the activity of what the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition calls the internal senses, end quote. Basically, we have this long-term memory network, but the causal relations are such, like images, ambiguous or indeterminate, whereas concepts can be unambiguous or determinate. Even more importantly, perhaps, proxy types as having contingent relations don't capture the logical relations between concepts that are necessary. Feser later points out that proxy types are at best instrumental signs, but instrumental signs cannot exist without formal signs. Note that words derive their intentionality from other words, but they can't all derive their meaning from other instrumental signs without a vicious infinite regress or circularity. Formal signs ground instrumental signs. Now, the last section deals with thought and language. Behaviorism can attempt to replace mental states with mere descriptions of behavior, yet this is impossible as principle, as people like Noam Chomsky has argued. Jumping ahead, there's an interesting reference to what has been referred to as second-order cognition, or thinking about our thinking, which is, by the way, central to traditional logic. It's linked with our ability to linguistically represent things. Think of the language of symbolic logic and how it can represent logical relations. In any case, remember a theme in this chapter is to understand man's intellect. We're different from mere animals. Some animals, though, have remarkably complex behavior. They seem to be able to hold and be able to change them based on evidence. Yet there's a distinction between simple seeing and epistemic seeing. There's a distinction between, for example, seeing that this thing is dangerous and all tigers are dangerous. Moving to the general universal proposition that, for any x, if x is a tiger, then x is dangerous requires linguistic ability to represent such a propositional attitude. Dr. Feser references Karl Popper's breakdown of the four functions of language. There's expressive, signaling, descriptive, and argumentative. Mere animals, to be sure, can engage in expressive and signaling language. However, descriptive and argumentative language requires compositionality, productivity, and systemicity. The final issue that's explored in this chapter is eliminativism. It's a radical view that eliminates concepts and thoughts. Usually it takes a mechanistic view of things. Only those things that can be written in the language of mathematics are things we can attribute anything to. There's no intentionality or aboutness to reality. It embraces scientism, where the only knowledge possible is from the so-called hard sciences. The thing is, though, it seems relatively clear that radical eliminativism is self-defeating as a philosophy, as is scientism. For instance, if all knowledge comes from the hard sciences, what justifies that very claim? It doesn't itself come from the hard sciences, so it's a self-defeating view. But if we define science broadly enough to include, say, general philosophy, then the statement becomes trivial, and it would allow avenues of possible knowledge and logical reasoning that those who embrace scientism usually reject. And actually, let's take a step back and think about logic itself. Dr. Feser writes that logic is also suffused with intentionality insofar as inferences aim at truth, and insofar as the logical relationships between statements presuppose that they have certain specific meanings, end quote. Now, obviously, there's much more to this book, and even to this chapter. We've only scratched the surface. The chapter does, interestingly, though, connect with some somewhat recent videos I've made when it comes to thinking about the logic of signs, universalism, and the logic of ideas and terms. For example, my video on Mortimer J. Adler's book 10 Philosophical Mistakes. Philosophy, to me, is not an intellectual chess game. Rather, it's a spiritual and intellectual quest for the true, good, and beautiful. And logic sets, so to speak, the foundations. Anyhow, I am the Amateur Logician. Please consider giving this video a like. You can visit my website at amateurlogician.com. It contains an extensive tutorial on traditional verbal style logic. There's a lot of recommendations and resources there, a lot of book recommendations, for example. I'm also in the process of creating a YouTube channel series on the philosopher René Descartes, and I'm also thinking about creating a traditional verbal style logic course as well. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now and be well.